Good morning, everyone from the West Coast. Good evening in Israel, in London, and good afternoon in the East Coast. Thank you, everyone, for joining for another discussion in the debrief of Israeli democracy with Unacceptable. And we are going to start very soon with Shai and Dahlia. I'll just give a little bit of background for those of you who doesn't know us. And before I forget, I want to really welcome the people from Small Emuni, USA, who joined. We are co-hosting this together. So I'm not sure if Esther is here, but it's great to work with Esther and the whole team. So today we are going to dive deep into what we all feel is kind of like challenging, where we see on one hand a very big optimism on the polls, showing that in the upcoming election in 2026, October, end of October, is showing that the opposition parties are really in every poll showing a majority, but on the same time, the opposition doesn't feel, on the same time that we are seeing the Netanyahu coalition, which we call it the right-wing coalition, very right-wing, extreme right-wing, taking, able to set up a new coalition. We're not sure exactly what this opposition comprised from. So today we have two amazing guests, Dahlia and Shai, and I'll just briefly introduce them. Dahlia is our columnist and public opinion expert, and being in every channel, looking on the numbers and explaining public opinions. And Shai is academic director at Molad, and is also you're part of the Oxford University. And we are going to have this in a different setup like we usually have. Shai will start with about 15 minutes explaining about the concept of the hollow center and how did we end up where we are. And then we will continue with the discussion like we always do with Dahlia and Shai about the polls and about the reality of the real parties that are currently running at the government. So for elections. So Dahlia and Shai, thank you for being here, and thank you
Thank you
everyone
so
who
much.
joined. And let's give it a start.
All right, should I start then?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi everyone, great seeing you. It's an honor to speak the same kind of talk with Dalia, so thanks for coming as well. I just as a kind of caveat or a kind of preliminary comment, I have a newborn upstairs, so if there, I hope there won't be any crisis. She's asleep, but just kind of saying that if there will be patient. Okay, so let's begin. Any serious analysis, I think, of Israeli politics today has to begin with the following question. How did the greatest security failure in Israel's history that happened under the most right-wing government Israel has ever had, after more than 15 years of almost uninterrupted right-wing rule, and yet produce no serious political alternative in terms of kind of substance on peace and security? Because this was not kind of, as you all might know already, this was not a random failure, right? It was the collapse of a coherent political doctrine managing the conflict, the idea that Hamas could be contained, the Palestinians permanently occupied and fragmented, and the conflict indefinitely managed at an acceptable cost to Israel is why the Israeli economy keeps booming. So that doctrine ended in a catastrophe. And what followed was hardly better. A war that began for many Israelis as a just response to October 7th was gradually captured by a far-right messianic government and vision of permanent war, permanent occupation, and permanent escalation. And 2.5 years later, Hamas remains in power. Hezbollah is intact and still attacking the north as we speak. Another confrontation with Iran looms, and violence in the West Bank is spiraling, threatening Israel with a third intifada. Not and I don't even start talking about what is happening with the Palestinians there. And Israel's international standing has completely collapsed. So, in any functioning democracy, a failure of this scale, especially on the issue most central to Israeli politics, which is security, should have opened the door to genuine political competition. We would expect a rival story to emerge, a different account of security or peace and Israel's future in the region. We would expect political leaders to say plainly, this completely failed. Let's try something else. But that is not what happened. Israeli public opinion did not move towards the liberal camp, and Dalia, I think, will talk about it more later. In many ways, it moved further to the right. Voters abandoned parts of the Netanyahu bloc, that's true, but not the worldview that produced the failure itself. And last week, we saw the clearest example of this kind of puzzle yet. One of Israel's main leaders, main liberal leaders from the liberal camp, Yair Lapid, effectively handed leadership of his whole camp to one of the architects of the very doctrine that collapsed on October 7th, Naftali Bennett, a politician who once described the Palestinian issue as a sharpnail in the butt. And if anyone thought Bennett had fundamentally reconsidered his views after October 7th, that might justify doing this, he made sure to dispel that impression using the launch of his new alliance with Lapid to promise that, and I quote, the land is ours and Israel would not give an inch to the enemy. So the main alternative to Netanyahu is now led by a politician who helped shape, defend, and normalize the strategic paradigm that failed, empowered by a liberal, centrist leader who once claimed on the UN stage to support a two-state solution. And this, I think, is the central puzzle of Israeli politics today. Why did a failure of this scale not produce a serious alternative? Why did Israeli politics double down on many of the same assumptions that failed so dramatically? And what does this tell us about the state of the liberal camp itself? So, my answer that I will argue for today is that for many years now, there has been a struggle within the liberal camp between two very different theories of political change. And the one that won and led the liberal camp for since at least 2013 is what led us to this moment. And the disagreement between these two theories of change, I believe, is the most important strategic debate shaping Israel's political future. And I have, of course, a clear view about which side is right, and I will try to argue for it. Though, of course, I very much welcome disagreement and discussion. Okay, so one side of this debate holds what I will call the polarization thesis. Okay, and according to this view, Israel's core problem is basically polarization. So the story goes like this. Tribal identity politics, mutual distrust, and extremists on both sides hijacking the public discourse led to everything we're experiencing now. So, polarization weakened Israeli society well before October 7th and signaled kind of vulnerability to its enemies, creating an opportunity for attack. It encouraged each camp to view the other as illegitimate, pushed leaders towards extremist measures such as the judicial coup or overhaul, undermined social solidarity, and also contributed to the kind of prolonged political paralysis of the repeated elections between 2019 and 2021. Now, most Israelis, so the claim continues, actually agrees on most things. The problem in Israel is not, according to this explanation, is not ideology, but noise amplified by social media and by small, highly motivated radical groups that distort debate and command disproportionate attention. And this logic is often condensed into a familiar slogan. I don't know how many of you have heard it before, that 80% of Israelis agree on 80% of the issues, 80% of the time. And the remaining extremists on both sides, so the story goes, are dragging the country into unnecessary conflict that makes all of us weak. So this is the diagnosis of the polarization thesis. Now, the prognosis is the following. If only the noise could be turned down if the silent majority could be reminded that they largely agree and they serve in the military together and even like one another, politics would somehow kind of drift back to the center and power would return to responsible mainstream actors. The solution, therefore, is said to lie in things like unity, moderation, dialogue, and deliberate focus on what unites rather than what divides. And now you can understand why the new name of Bennett Lapid's party is Together. And I will get back to that in a few minutes. So this worldview has guided Israel's major liberal centrist parties since roughly 2013, from Yesh Atid and Blue and White through Hamachaneh HaMamlachti and today figures such as Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, and to some extent Gadi Eisenkot. It's not 100% clear yet, but he's going in the same direction as we speak. And it has also shaped much of Israel's civil society and philanthropic strategy with heavy investment in dialogue initiatives, unity projects, and a steady production of consensus documents. Now, at bottom, this approach rests on a distinctive conception of politics, what politics is. So the aim, according to them, in politics is not persuasion, not shaping public opinion or contesting values, but rather reassurance, right? So politics becomes a project of reminding people that they already agree rather than asking them to reconsider what they believe. So instead of arena of argument and mobilization, politics becomes something of tone or politeness and togetherness or optimization, management, and efficiency. The idea is that we do not disagree about substance, only how to make things we agree about better. Now, alongside this thesis, polarization thesis, the diagnosis and the prognosis, came a claim which is really important to our discussion about the Israeli election, about political realism and power. So the liberal camp, we are told, failed because it became too radical, right? Too purist and too uncompromised or lefty, captured by the fringes of the left and disconnected from the mainstream. The corrective then appears, straightforward. Move back to the center, even towards the right, avoid decisive issues, appeal to soft right voters, and demonstrate responsibility. That's kind of the theory. Elections on this view are won by following polls and existing public opinion, not by trying to shape it. Values and reform can come later once power has been secured, or as Yair Lapid likes to call it, first you get elected. That's kind of the theory. Now, this story may have sounded plausible 13 years ago when it first took hold. Today, despite remaining the dominant strategy across much of the liberal camp, repeated failure should have, in my view, stripped it of credibility altogether because, as I'll try to argue, it no longer survived contact with reality. So why does the kind of polarization thesis fail? The first problem with it is just empirical. And again, I leave this side of the debate and discussion to Dahlia. The data tell just a very different story. But just in a nutshell, Israel has not polarized between two extremes. It has shifted dramatically in one direction. The radical left has no political power in Israel whatsoever. The mainstream left has moved rightward, and the far right, the ultra far Kahanist right, has quite literally captured the state. So just to give you an example, it has its own popular media channels, the Ministry of National Security, and I'm talking about Kahanists now, not about kind of just right-wing, radical right-wing people. So again, it has its own popular media channels, the Ministry of National Security, a minister in the Ministry of Defense with authority over the West Bank, the head of the Shin Bet, the Minister of Communications, the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Finance, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And as a factual matter, the polarization thesis, according to which Israeli society went to the extreme on both sides, just does not hold. It's just a factual thing that it's not true. But beyond the empirical problem, there is a second deeper problem with the polarization thesis, which is conceptual. Politics does not happen where we agree. Yes, most Israelis agree on We want better healthcare or economic growth and maybe a strong military. But Israel's future does not turn on those issues. It turns on precisely the questions over which there is a deep and genuine disagreement. It turns on whether Israel remains a liberal democracy or moves towards Jewish supremacy, whether Arab citizens are treated as full equals or as permanent suspects, whether Israel has recognized borders or lives under conditions of permanent occupation. These are not marginal questions, they are the central questions of Israeli politics. And while one side has fought over these issues clearly and unapologetically and relentlessly, the other has largely tried to avoid them, even after the judicial overhaul, a historic security failure, and the longest war in Israel's history. Much of the Israeli center today continues to campaign. If you watched the latest kind of videos that the campaigns of Lapid and Eisenkot and Bennett kind of launched, they are on anti-corruption, efficient governance, and national unity. But avoidance here, in my view, is not pragmatism. It is resignation. It leaves the political field open to capture again by the other side. And it rests on a profound misdiagnosis of what political conflict actually is. Now, there is also a third problem with the polarization thesis, and it may be the most damning one for that kind of view. It concerns its claim to political realism. So, pragmatically speaking, this so-called realist strategy has now been tested again and again and again and again. And it has failed on its own terms, not my lefty terms, on its own terms. For more than 15 years, the polarization thesis has shaped the dominant strategy of the liberal camp. Mamlachtiyut, unity, moderation, politeness, restraint were meant to be the remedy of what's going on in Israeli society. The idea was, again, that avoiding conflict, lowering the temperature, and appealing to soft right voters through efficiency and management and unity rather than substance, polarization would recede and power would return to responsible actors. So it promised unity, yet Israel is more polarized than at any point in its history. It promised moderation, yet the most extreme government Israel has ever seen is in power for almost full term, and Kahanism has been completely normalized. It promised to give voice to a silent majority, yet the overtone window has shifted decisively to the extreme right. It promised electoral success by appealing to the soft right, yet the political center grew largely, and Bennett does it again, by swallowing what remained of the left, not by persuading the right to move at all. It promised to defend Israeli democracy and the rules of the game, yet we are still living through an ongoing, unprecedented judicial coup. So in practice, instead of bringing Israel back towards the center, the liberal camp's version of pragmatism steadily erased its own voice and vacated the field for the very far right. So the polarization thesis, it is important to understand, is not a new idea, despite how some of its proponents present it nowadays in the elections. It has been the dominant approach for more than a decade, and it is precisely this approach that helped bring us to this point where we are now. So to finish this kind of short presentation, let me now turn to the alternative thesis, the one that I want to defend, and I will kind of elaborate on it when we discuss it together. Very briefly, my thesis is this. Over the past 2 decades, the liberal camp gradually abandoned its moral vocabulary and its story about Israel's future, its identity, its conflicts, and its purpose in the pursuit of unity and soft right voters. At the same time, successive governments led by Netanyahu systematically worked to delegitimize political opposition itself, so much so that Naftali Bennett nowadays and Avigdor Lieberman are considered lefty traitors. This did not happen overnight. Beginning around 2013, some would argue even before that, we saw coordinated campaigns against liberal civil society organizations, first against the New Israel Fund, breaking the silence. These were followed by attacks on Arab citizens and their political participation, on the Supreme Court, on the media, and eventually on center-left Zionists themselves. Society was divided into the people increasingly defined as the right-wing bloc, and the enemy. Political disagreement was reframed as disloyalty. Opposition came to be treated as a form of treason. Now, instead of confronting this strategy directly, much of the liberal camp accommodated it and actually joined it against the left and the Arabs. And until the mass protest against the judicial overhaul, large parts of the center and center left, as said, largely followed suit. So faced with a radical right, they distanced themselves from the left, from civil society, and eventually from their own core values in order to appeal kind of non-lefties, non-conflictual, strong on security, responsible, and unifying. And as a result, the right came to control, and this is the key point, not only political power, but the boundaries of legitimacy itself. What could be said, which positions were deemed patriotic, and which ideas were ruled out in advance. And we see it now about questions with political collaborations with the Arab parties, yes or no, and we can talk about it later. The liberal camp increasingly located itself inside those boundaries, even as they shifted further and further away from what had once been mainstream Israeli political morality. Now, this pattern fits the data far better than the polarization thesis, and it matches the political reality many of us, I think, recognize. Now, and this is where I end, if this diagnosis is correct, where does it leave us with kind of analyzing the Bennett-Lapid recent unification? So let us return to Bennett's statement at the joint press conference declaring the name of his new party, as I said, together. So standing beside Lapid, Bennett said this: "An era of division is over." And I quote, yeah, "An era of division is over. Now is the time for repair. A government of professionals and CEOs, people of execution who think only about the good of Israel. The state will once again be properly managed." And he then moved to his kind of campaign promises, his and Lapid's. And I quote again, "On the first day of the new government under my leadership, we will establish a commission of inquiry into the October 7th massacre in order to bring truth to the families and answers to the people of Israel," as if we don't know what happened on October 7th, but put that aside. "We will limit the tenure of a prime minister to 8 years, and it will apply first of all to me, and we will protect the lands of our homeland and not give a single centimeter or inch to the enemy." So this quote, I think, tells the whole story. Once again, the center left, or now it's the center right, or I don't know how to call it, I call it the hollow center in my research, is willing to sideline its own substantive views on the central issue in Israeli politics, security, even after almost 3 years of war, and continue operating within the political horizon shaped by Netanyahu and his poison machine, in which saying something about security and peace makes you a traitor at best, or someone who is not connected to reality at worst, but definitely to lose seats and votes. And now Lapid, a liberal politician who once supported the two-state solution at the United Nations, is now effectively legitimizing a leader who publicly supports annexation at worst and managing the conflict at best. Now, all of this is done in the hope of gaining, again, these kind of imaginary soft right voters through a platform centered on clean politics, efficient management, and national unity, as if the past 3 years had been a routine crisis of governance rather than one of the gravest political security failures in Israel's history. As if we managed things differently and kept kind of occupying things and kept kind of the situation as is, things would have been better. And unfortunately, it increasingly seems that Eisenkot is following the same path. So I'll end by saying it is difficult to predict whether this strategy might succeed in producing some kind of temporary change government that could free Israel from its current far-right coalition. And that in itself would be a significant improvement. I want to say this, like even if we will go to this kind of centrist right route, it will be an improvement over the current government. And I don't like people who are kind of saying there is no difference because there is. And politics is a high stakes game, and we see it in kind of lives of people who are getting killed because of it. But still, what I want to stress it, even if we have such a change government, it would still leave Israel a very, very long way from becoming the kind of society many people in this room aspires to be. So there's like much work ahead to convince in my thesis against the polarization thesis in the coming years. That's it from me.
Shai, amazing. Really well said. And I will basically want to build on that and ask Dahlia to basically try to go through what Shai said in that well and talk about the current status of the public opinions as it's seen in the polls and maybe have extra information that are not in the polls about how does it actually going to impact building the coalition and so on. Ask to unmute. Here you go.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you. First of all, thank you, Ophir, for organizing. And I have to say, it's really a pleasure to speak together with Shai. It's very tempting to get into the theses, but let's just say this is very boring because I agree with pretty much everything Shai said. And those of you on the call who know me know that I do not agree so easily with so many things. I'm not an 80-80-80 person. But I do think that you're laying out a very convincing thesis. And of course, I share the critique of the strategy of the center. Let me go into the polls a little bit before I, relate directly to what Shai has said. But just to explain that, I want to give a basic structure. I want to start by giving a basic structure that goes a little further back than what you asked about, Ophir. And I want to explain that what we see in polls and what we see in electoral outcomes year after year is that there's one question that is a very good predictor for the kind of breakdown we're going to see in Knesset, whether it's parties of the left, right, or center, or whether it's a coalition for or against Bibi. And that is a very simple question that we ask people in every survey. It's not even a demographic question. It's just, how do you define yourself? Do you define yourself as left, right, or center? And this is, to my mind, one of the most fundamental questions to be asked in surveys. I don't know why, I don't know how any pollster can live without it. And what's remarkable in Israel is that it almost doesn't matter if you ask the question a little bit differently. If you give a 5-point scale, a 7-point scale, if you tell people, are you right wing, moderate right, center, moderate left, or if you give them more nuanced versions, the results are almost always the same. So people know exactly what they mean, and those results are extremely predictive. What they say about their own self-identity is a very strong predictor of which side of the map they're going to vote for. Now, of course, if there's more than one party in the center, you don't know exactly which one they'll vote for. More than one on the right, we know exactly who they'll vote for because then we just ask or we find out if they're religious or not. And then we know roughly if they're going to vote for an ultra-Orthodox party or, a Shas or Likud or something like that. And on the left, we pretty much know because there aren't that many left-wing parties competing right now. So if somebody says they're left, very high chances they're going to vote for a left-wing party. And if they're Jewish, they're going to probably vote for a Zionist left-wing party. Arab, obviously, most of them, the vast majority of them vote for one of the parties representing them. So that basic structure is really key to understanding what we might see in elections. And it has shifted over time. I will spare you going all the way back to the 1990s. But let's say, you all probably know that the majority of the Jewish population defines themselves as some gradation of right wing. And I can say that that number reached kind of a peak ahead of the last elections. That makes sense because we saw that the public voted for the most right wing government in Israeli history. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that over 60%, maybe even pushing up to 65%, depending on exactly how you ask the question, define themselves as right wing in the Jewish population. The overall average is brought down by Palestinian citizens of Israel who have very low rate of right wing. But remember, they also vote and they turn out at a much lower rate than Jewish population. So we have, you know, at that time, over 60%, close to 65% who called themselves right wing. We had about 20% in total, but among the Jewish population, about 12 to 14% who identified as left wing. And those numbers go up and down a little bit. What rarely fluctuates for the last, I'm going to say 15 years, maybe even closer to 20, is the percentage of people who define themselves as centrist. It's about 25%. And it almost actually doesn't matter if you ask if it's Jewish or Arab respondents, just that they mean very different things. So first of all, you understand the structure. The majority being right wing hasn't changed. The minority or left wing, that hasn't changed, and the center remains around 25%. One quick point, just to rush up to the recent years before we even get to where we are now. If I said that there was a height of sort of a peak of right-wing self-identification, which is why we have the government we have, throughout the year 2023, if you track all of the consistent survey research being done, for example, by the Israel Democracy Institute, the number of people who self-identified as left and particularly center began to grow just a little bit. And the combined total reached 47% among the Jewish population. Just this, no graphs, just remember that one number, 47%. The number of the Jewish population who identified as right wing went down to 50%, 3-point gap. Okay. And that's the smallest gap in my research that I could, find tracking these longitudinal surveys in about 6 years. So it was really a shift in a strange direction we hadn't seen in a very long time. That was the data in September 2023. We all know what happened on October 7th, and shortly after that, the numbers of right wing began to climb again, back to where they were. At the same time, now I'm going to shift into electoral gear. What happened after that is that support for the Netanyahu government collapsed. It had already been low. They never had a grace period. This government never had a grace period. Within a few weeks, they lost their majority in survey research, but it went to an unprecedented low after October 7th, even as the percentage of Israelis defining themselves as right-wing was growing, but particularly among the Jewish population, of course. So the electoral situation is that for about 6 months, the government did worse than ever. The government began to recover in survey research in about mid-2024. It took about 6 months, but then you started to see the incremental recovery. And now, really for since about August 2024, the parties of the current coalition are really where they were in polls all throughout 2023, which is to say, not a majority, in the low 50-seat range out of a Knesset of 120 seats, but back up, following their post-October 7th hit. And the basic map is that they have that same number of seats in the low 50s, even 49, as low as 49, as high as 55, depending on the weather or the survey. But it really never changes from that range among the credible surveys. There are also 2 companies doing right-wing advocacy surveys that always show them higher. But even in those surveys, there is no upward trajectory. They are stable. They're locked in. They seem to have hit a ceiling. All the rest of the opposition parties, and this is extremely consistent, are getting between 67 and 70 seats altogether, but about 10 of those are for parties representing Palestinian citizens of Israel mostly, and the Zionist parties, Jewish parties are locking themselves into a position that they're not going to form a coalition with those, at least those who are leading the opposition bloc. Yair Golan is the only one who just recently has reiterated that Arab parties should be seen as partners in coalition building, but he's the only one, and he's probably not going to win the elections, let's face it. All to say that basic map with the current parties of the current coalition, Netanyahu's coalition, better than they were after October 7th, not good enough to win the elections outright at this moment. The opposition parties getting, as many as 70 seats, but the Zionist parties rarely getting even, something like 61, which is a majority, but it's very rare that the Zionist parties alone have 61. And by the way, 61 is no magic number. It is a legal number for building a coalition, but it's a terrible number. The previous government, the change government, had 61 and was unable to sustain it. And that basic breakdown has not changed in about 2 years, almost 2 years now. Okay, that is a remarkably stable situation. And frankly, it's extraordinary when you consider the kinds of cataclysmic changes that have happened in Israeli society. And I mean, let's say those numbers really stabilized for the coalition and the opposition in about August of 2024. By September, when Israel assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, they didn't change. When Israel first went to war, full out war with Iran in June 2025, all of the reporting internationally and locally, domestically said Netanyahu could win the next election outright. They just forgot to look at polls because the polls never changed. And in the current war, not only did the polls not change, but they actually got a little bit worse for Netanyahu, particularly because, and this gets into where, sort of starts to touch on what Shai is talking about, mostly because the war ended. Okay, support for the war was extremely high in the current war with Iran. It was beginning to decline because people were getting exhausted, but still very high, of course, driven by the Jewish population. And then there was a trap because the ceasefire was forced onto Netanyahu, and that was even worse because it was like people had lived through the war without actually seeing the goals accomplished. So what we have is these two axes. The Netanyahu coalition axis, which is stuck at a ceiling, still unable to win elections, at least today. This is not a prediction. This is where we have been for the last 2 years. And yet, what we saw is that society moved further to the right after October 7th, basically back to where it was, on the eve of the last elections. Those numbers are also fairly stable, I should say. In a way, I'm even surprised because right after October 7th, I thought the left is going to go down to nothing. Center may grow, and the right will go as high as it possibly can. And that didn't happen. Even that map is fairly stable, but it means there are far more people who identify as right wing than those who are actually voting for the coalition today. And that's why we see those parties that are challenging Netanyahu are driven by right wing leaders like Naftali Bennett or people who, frankly, I have no idea what they stand for, whether it's Gadi Eisenkot or Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz is irrelevant now, but A, I wouldn't rule him out. He has a way of kind of staying in the game. B, remember that he was taking up that position as the head of the opposition in people's minds. After October 7th, he polled up to 40 seats. I still don't know what the guy stands for. And those are the leaders, in the public's mind. You have Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman, who's been around for a long time. We know what he stands for, hardline nationalist extremism, but not a secular version. And, then you have Yair Lapid and the so-called center. The center has remained, as I said, but I think that, I'll try to end up here so we can leave time for questions, I think, Ophir, is that?
Yep.
And wrap up. The point about the center is that, all of the rest of the people who identify as right wing, that majority that I spoke about, which by the way, if you look at the total population, Jews and Arabs weighted together, it's about 54-55% who identify as right wing. And from their perspective, Yair Lapid, who hasn't really changed his views, if anything, he's gotten a little more, distant from the language of, resolving the conflict diplomatically through two-state solution. He is regularly described as far left from the Israeli mainstream. People like that think Yair Golan is a complete extremist. And I think that people who identify themselves as center may still be about a quarter of the population, right? That's what they are in the numbers. But many of them would not really even be able to consider the idea of voting for someone like Yair Golan because he is portrayed as so extreme relative to Lapid. Lapid is still getting votes, right? But his numbers are way down compared to what he actually holds in the outgoing Knesset, about a third. He's lost about 2/3 of his support because even centrists would prefer to vote for one of the military figures, ex-military figures, and people who represent a hardline security approach and stay far away from the big questions. So I would love to get deeper into Shai's thesis, but I think I will stop there with the analysis of where we are, and we can take questions.
So I will basically start. I mean, so there was a lot of questions coming when people registered. So I kind of like summarized them into some buckets. But one of the key things that I take from both what you said is that there was a point, a time before October 7 where we started to think that instead of like describing left, center, and right, we are starting to think about the watershed will be on the liberal democratic, those who believe in the Declaration of Independence, and those who are not. Right? So that was all the way up to October 7th. What we felt when we saw every week for 39 weeks people going out on the streets for that reason. Uh, um, and still, what I hear from both of you is that now we are back to the left, center, right, and the question about the public opinion, and maybe Shai or Daria, you can take it first. I mean, like that, do they? The definition of right wing is now kind of like all over the place, right? You can be a right wing Ben Gvir, you can be a right wing Netanyahu, and you can be even the ultra orthodox define themselves as right wing, even though they're totally socialist, taking money from the government, right? I mean, like so, how? I mean, and to your point, Dalia, just to finalize my thought, I mean, like we have about almost like 40 seats in the Knesset of people. Oh, sorry, 40 seats in the potential new coalition of people we have no idea what they stand for, right? Like, and those who went on the streets are willing to take anything but Bibi, even though it's as long as it's considered right wing. That's your point, Dalia. I mean, it's almost like the
Um,
right wing is
no, I think that
become
it's
like a
more than
label.
just,
Like
I think
I
it's
don't
more
want to
than
be
that.
defined as left, and that's why I'm
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
I tell you what I really think about that. There is, of course, a breakdown within people who define themselves as right wing. There are those who support Netanyahu, and we know, they basically support what this government stands for. Otherwise, they wouldn't be with him by now. But there is also all the rest of them, right? When I said there's over 60% of Jews who consider themselves right wing, and they're not all voting for Netanyahu's coalition, because by the way, that number in percentages, the average number of people in percentage wise who are voting for Netanyahu or support him personally or anything he stands for is between 40 and 45%. Okay, that's what you get when you ask uh, head to head competitions over who's best suited to be prime minister or any of his positions or the coalition itself. Everybody else is not voting for him. And I said there's over 60% who are right wing in Jewish society. So there is a big chunk who are not voting for him. And I do think the issue of their perception that they are committed to liberal values, they want to answer the questions finally once and for all that the state should have, the source of authority is the people and not God for the state, even if they want to have privately be religious. They want to, they believe that they can support and advance liberal values. I think that's totally unresolved contradiction within the right. And in general in Israeli society, I should say, I have an article on that from just a few like last week, I guess. So self-promotion, you can read my article about the contradiction that goes all the way back to Jabotinsky. It's fascinating if it weren't so actually life-threatening for the other people between the river and the sea. But I think that that is what they are saying to themselves. They are saying we consider ourselves right wing, but I mean, we expect to have a liberal democracy and be right wing. We expect to have a liberal democracy and security as well. So that's why we support military figures. And I think that's what they're telling themselves, even though I personally see that as unsustainable. And I think it has proven itself unsustainable precisely because of the situation we're in. But I'll let Shai also weigh in on it.
Oh, just a second.
Yeah, thanks. I don't have kind of anything kind of to add to what Daria just said, but I do want to kind of pick up on a point. You mentioned kind of the people who went to the street and the kind of protest against the judicial overhaul, and I think it's like a really important moment in the kind of recent history of the liberal camp, because what happened there was for the first time in many, many years, it wasn't led by politicians, but the kind of liberal public in Israel went to the streets and created real political competition. This is when, as Dalia said, the right wing started to kind of decline in the polls. And they was able to create this kind of political competition because what kind of Yariv Levin did as a reaction to what Yariv Levin did and the kind of threat to democracy. But one of their main strategies was again, the hollow center strategy was to put anything that is related to security and the occupation aside in order to keep the lines kind of together and get as much support in Israeli society as possible. Now, it seemed as the right strategy back then because the protests really kind of took off and got in momentum. But reality has reminded us that we live in Israel. And what I try to kind of say to people all the time to understand how severe the failure of political competition is in Israel is to imagine an American president, okay, go onto the podium and say to their people, you know what? During this election, I'm not going to talk about the economy. This is just something that I'm not going to talk about. People even can't imagine such a thing. There were always kind of centrist leaders in America. There were always centrist leaders in the UK or in other kind of Western countries. They never completely neglected or converged to the right on the main issue that defines their country's politics. So New Labour in the UK went to the right on economics, but they didn't say we have nothing to say about economics or we adopt the position of the rights on economics. And the fact that in the protest movement, uh, in such a kind of massive failure of the government or kind of such a threat to democracy, still we weren't able to say anything about security or the conflict. It just goes to show how deep the problem is. And just one final point that I think is kind of maybe an optimistic kind of route for the future is that I think the division within the protest movement between the kind of the majority of the people who were about just liberal democracy, let's not talk about security or occupation, and the very minuscule minority of the kind of bloc against the occupation in the protest, I think it kind of represents the division and fragmentation that occurred in the liberal camp over the last 20 years. And I think it's a harmful division, and I think the way forward will be to reunite in a way. So this division is between one group who says, let's put the security and conflict aside, we cannot win on that front, and another group who says, so there is the kind of, that's the liberal camp, and the other group is the anti-occupation group, I call them. And this is a group that kind of let politics slip away and became kind of perceiving politics as kind of a moral agenda, that their role in society is to kind of put a mirror in front of Israel's face, but without any kind of political consequences or a party that is successful. They basically left the kind of party scene almost altogether. And I think instead of kind of the anti-occupation camp and the liberal camp, we need to unite all together and be again the peace camp. That's, I think, the only way forward for a kind of credible opposition in Israel. But that's it.
Yeah. Dalia,
Can I just add one thing
yeah,
that I
sure.
just want to make one more point and then before opening it up? I mean, I hope, I hope it wasn't like hard to follow, but I just want to say that basically the elections right at this moment are a complete toss-up. That's what it comes down to. The current government does not have a majority and has not had a majority in surveys in 2 years. The opposition is at the cusp of a majority for Zionist parties, but not good enough. And yet, altogether, the opposition has an overwhelming majority of 70 seats. There is so much at play here. I think that these basic blocks, the current Netanyahu camp and everybody else, hasn't changed in such a long time that I have a hard time seeing what will change the size of those major blocks, even by the elections. What more could possibly happen, that has not happened already? So you can, I would be careful not to get distracted by the political chatter that you're going to hear for the next, many months. But there is so much at play.
And just to clarify, I mean, to everyone within the call, is that, I mean, like, we are speaking as if these were normal elections coming up, right? And they are not. I mean, there are still a lot of voices that are doubting that there will be election, or there will be a fair election, or there will be. So we are in a high stake election, definitely season, and we are still we are talking about them as if they were just a political debate. So And it's not. I mean, like it's actually there is a lot of on the stake for the security of Israel in general, and that's kind of like what make it very confusing because one of the things that we heard we had Yair in a vote like a week ago or so speaking about how Hungary right won the election just by bringing a right wing I mean getting everyone around a right wing leader and it almost feels like Israelis are now feeling like that's the only way to win right and therefore they're looking for either the Eisenkot or the Bennett option, even though the right wing definition is basically across almost everyone. And that's kind of like, I mean, I wanted to ask about the public opinion about Israel in the war, right? So, Shai, you're in UK. Dahlia, you know very well the public opinion in the US. I mean, it almost sounds like we are. I mean, one of the things that Magyar did in Europe was like speaking up to the Europeans and say like, I will bring back Hungary to Europe, and that kind of like brought the young people to vote for him and so on and so on. Do we think that what we hear from the leaders who claim to be the opposition leader will bring back the public opinion of the world back to support what Israel is doing? Or are we just trying to save Israel from democracy crisis and deal with everything else later? What do you think, Dalia?
I'm not sure if I understood the last part of the question. Do I think this is going to bring Israelis back to
No,
supporting?
do you think that the Americans will now say like, oh, we have
Oh,
we don't have
Americans.
Netanyahu is a very bad
Mm,
brand now
right.
for
So if
everyone,
they, yeah,
right? And now we're going to have a new prime minister, maybe Bennett, maybe Eisenkot, I don't know who. Is that good enough
would
to
that?
actually bring back the polls about sympathy to Israel around the world, or that's not enough?
No, I don't think it's enough, really. I mean, in America, it will help because America, remember, has been the most, biggest holdout of support for Israel. And even that is severely, deteriorating now. It's not nearly where it is in some of the European countries, but even that is slipping. And we've seen, in the Gallup and Pew surveys that sympathy for Palestinians is, either close or even overtaking sympathy for Israel. And so it's going to take much more than just a prime minister. I mean, again, in the US, I think changing Netanyahu will make a difference, but it won't go back to where it was. And in Europe, I think it's going to be a lot harder than that. I think that, you know, you, the rest of the world is kind of on to Israel, right? It's not just Netanyahu, it's the policies. And I've had, any number of European diplomats tell me this, like, but they know their publics. And I think that we can all, you can feel it when you see the popular criticism in Europe. I mean, for all that is the Israeli government, or even just pro-Israel figures would like to say, well, it's all driven by anti-Semitism, or it's all driven by, just radical, weird campaigns that are fashionable right now. Yeah, there's some of that, and there's no doubt there's a wave of anti-Semitism, but I do think that it's unrelated. If the wave of anti-Semitism were to go away, and I hope it does, yesterday, um, the criticism of Israel's policies will remain, and that is driving a lot of anger at Israel. It's just not going to go away when Netanyahu goes away. Again, it
And
will
Shai,
help in America. Netanyahu's numbers are so poor, including, by the way, among American Jews. So it will help, but it won't be enough.
Shai, anything to add?
Again, I completely agree. I just think that the story that the Israelis try to sell themselves, that you can be kind of a liberal without adhering to anything related to Israel's kind of security apparatus and security policies and occupation, that worked for a number of years. But after what happened kind of in the war in Gaza and everything else, that's not going to change. Not here, definitely not in the UK, which I think is kind of one of the countries where Israel is seen the worst, both on the left and the right, but in other
Yeah.
countries as well. I just
So I
completely
want
agree with
to
Dalia.
take us towards the end of the conversation with a little bit of thinking about what can we do from here in that sense, like again, like a liberal Zionist Jewish diaspora and Israeli expats who are really believing in everything that we have said, and they're not able to vote, obviously in Israel. I mean, so those of us who are able to vote, fly and vote right? And if you haven't heard about the Eight Coalition initiative, please do that and follow them. But What do you think that the liberal Jewish community can do around the world to help support moving the Overton window? And I'll use a shy. It's not just winning the election; it's actually trying to move the Overton window toward the idea that the security of Israel depends on, in order to be Jewish and democratic and liberal, we have to do both saving democracy and ending the occupation and find a solution to separate ourselves from the Palestinian. What have you seen people doing, Shai, in the UK maybe? And Dalia, what are your thoughts about that being talking to Jewish Americans so much? Shai,
Yeah,
you can start.
can I
Yeah.
start? So very, very, very quickly, I think the bottom line is that if you want to kind of help Israel become or get back to, depends on who you talk to be some kind of an Israel liberal democracy, this is time to take sides. The kind of institutions that have been kind of neutral for years needs to understand that by being neutral, you are preserving these kind of the rules of the game that Netanyahu and his far right coalition has set up. If you are supporting initiatives, if you're teaching your kids around about Israel, tell them there is a good side in Israel and there is a bad side in Israel, and you need to support the good side in order for it to win and persuade the other side to get a majority. Israel will not go on track and it won't be a country that you can identify with without changing fundamentally by persuasion. I can't, like Israel is the only country in the world that I know. I worked in the British Parliament as well. That 4 months before the elections, nobody is talking about persuading anyone. It's just about how we kind of try to kind of put masks on to kind of get the right-wing votes because it's a right-wing country. Get back to political persuasion, get back to invest in the institutions that kind of change the fundamental direction of the country. It's a long-run battle. In the there might be steps in between that we need to make compromises, but the bigger picture is this: if we don't win the argument about the soul of the country, which includes the things about the occupation and security, there will be nothing to fight about, and it means to take sides. That's the bottom line.
Dalia?
I don't know if I have a lot to add to that because again, like you said, I mean, both of you said it, right? If people are citizens, they should come back and vote, and there are ways to do that. You could also advocate for Israel to change its laws and allow absentee voting, but that won't happen quickly enough. And also, the Israelis are broader of various political stripes, so it won't necessarily change things. But if you're not an Israeli citizen, I mean, I just think that you've all said it, yes, take a side. I would say, suggest supporting the organizations that you connect to who are supporting these kinds of values, who are taking these kinds of positions, support them financially, invite them, or, invite them to speak, but that's really speaking abroad, right? In terms of the upcoming elections, um, I honestly, Israel is a sovereign country. You either vote or you don't. So, I mean, there's plenty you can do in the long term. Talk to your Israeli friends, explain, Israelis have a hard time seeing these contradictions because they're too inside it. And you know what? I understand them because I'm one of them, right? We're dealing with a lot of stuff here. And I know how easy it is to get completely, sucked into like just how difficult it is day to day. It really is. But just sometimes having conversations with people that shake you out of very, very parochial mindset. Sorry to say it, I'm Israeli, I can say it. Really helps. So in the long run, I think that's what people could be doing. But it's a sovereign country. If you can't vote in elections, don't expect to have an influence on elections. Definitely, definitely support in any way possible the organizations advancing the values that we're talking about. And when I say any way possible, I mean money.
And I would add on that just to close is that I mean we have learned as Americans this concept of a swing state, right, where we don't have the right to vote in a specific district or in a specific state, but we are helping the district with any effort we can to influence the federal level. So in my head, it's very similar to how we can help from here, even if we cannot vote in Israel. And the other thing I will add on what both of you said is because we are understanding what being a minority here in America and in other countries means, we can advocate more about the inclusion of the Arab society in the government. When people are coming, and people are coming from the Eisenkot and Bennett and Lapid parties, just really talk through that. Dahlia and Shai, I really, really appreciate you taking the time in your evening. And thank you everyone who joined. We will have this recording available at the evening on the YouTube. And just keep being engaged and keep spreading the word to your families and kids and younger generations who need to see the other side of the liberal camp of Israel. Thank you and see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.